Howdy, folks. Welcome to Winsloe United Church. I can tell you that one of the greatest fears that a preacher has is coming to church and nobody's here. Guess what? Today's one of those days. Now, you've been attending services here at Winsloe United Church over the past little bit. We've been speaking about the Beatitudes. I was going to continue to talk about them today, but then something happened. The coronavirus that's devastated China and Italy started to arrive here. First, there was just a few cases, and then the dam broke. And we've been flooded with frightening news ever since. The United States government declared a national emergency. The World Health Organization declared the coronavirus an official global pandemic. And then all the dominoes started falling over. Concerts, conventions, schools, churches, they all announced that they were canceling and shutting down during the crisis. Even the liquor store here in PEI closed. But then again, with the Toronto Maple Leafs not playing, there's no need for anybody to drown the sorrow, so they might as well be closed. Now, last week, every media report fueled fire and fanned flames of fear until they became a wildfire. By the end of the week, there are examples of panic everywhere, including panic buying in the grocery stores, as people feared that this might last a long time. Lysol wipes, going for $80 a carton. Toilet paper. Well, I guess we have to be bears and go to the woods. It's at times like this that uncertainty, when the world seems out of control, and fear and danger and suffering, people ask questions. They ask, where's God? Why is he letting these things happen? Why is he doing nothing? Is there a God? There is a God? So I want to spend some time talking about these questions today. You see, folks, dark times are unavoidable. Just take a look at your own family, your own situations. Many of you listening to me today have either lived through or grew up in families where the memories of World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, the Cuban Missile Crisis, September 11th terrorist attacks, the Dust Bowl 60s, were a part of lived history. I remember watching videos as a child as to what to do during a nuclear attack. But even without these great events, tens of thousands of people die every day, whether it's through illness, age, unexpected accidents, and the people around them enter into a world of shock and grief and darkness. Now, these things don't generate the headlines that a pandemic spawned, but their individual dark times is just as real as our collective one here today. Shakespeare understood this when he put these words into the mouth of Macduff. Each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike the heaven on its face. When dark times come, there's two basic ways that people respond. The more religious person says, why is God punishing me? What am I doing wrong? Maybe I need to go to church more. Maybe I need to pray more. Maybe I have to be nicer to people. That's a very moralistic approach to dark times. Pray more, give more of your time and money to charities, read the Bible more, be nice to people, call your mother, call your grandmother. The other approach is not moralism, it's cynicism. Whereas religious people tend to think that dark times as a punishment and a call to come back to God and to live a more godly life, secular people look at dark times as proof that there is no God. They say things like, well, if God is supposed to be all good and all powerful, then why is this good and powerful God allowing these things to happen to people? That's just proof that there is no God. Well, the book of Job starts out by telling us that both of these approaches are wrong. And that they are not just wrong, but in fact they are spiritual dead ends. From the book of Job, 1 Job, starting in chapter 6, we hear. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came with them also. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth upon it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on this earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears the Lord and shuns evil." Well, does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything that he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and his herd are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, "Very well. Everything that he has is in your power. But on the man himself, do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So what does this mean? Well, basically, God was saying how good Job was. Then Satan says, well, of course Job is great. You're giving him everything. The only reason that Job is the way that he is because he is getting something from you. However, let bad things happen to him, and you will see that he's no good. You'll get the real cut of his jib then. If it's no longer worth his while to be faithful, he will turn away from you in a heartbeat. He'll curse you to your face. And God says, very well. Everything that he has is now in your power. But you can't lay a finger on Job himself. And so then Satan leaves to torment Job. Well, the first reaction to this is to be horrified that God and Satan are playing games with this man's life. And that's an understandable reaction. But if you have it, please don't miss what's really going on here. You see, this passage shows that there is an asymmetrical relationship between God and suffering. What does that mean? Well, on one hand, it is Satan's idea to torment Job, not God's. It's Satan's idea, and it's Satan that goes and does it. This is a way of getting across a very, very important fact. That when God made this world, he made it to be good. He didn't put disease in it. He didn't make it with natural disasters. That isn't the world that God made. Take a look at Genesis. The world that God made was declared to be very good. This wasn't a place of death. This wasn't a place of disease. It wasn't a place of disaster. These are not the things that God made. They are in this world, yes, but God didn't directly make them. These are forces of darkness that were unleashed when we turned away from God, when we rebelled. We are the ones who unleashed these forces, not God. So, on the one hand, God is not responsible for all these bad things that are happening to Job. No, that's Satan's handiwork. But we see that God is still in absolute control. Look what's happening in this verse. Satan and God are not equals here. God is dictating what Satan can and can't do to Job. God is overruling the evil. God permits it, yes. He says, very well. But then he limits it. He says, Satan, you can do this, but you can't do that. Why does God do this? Because God only allows Satan to act when God knows that Satan will only accomplish the exact opposite of what he wants to be accomplished. As my beautiful wife Ruth often says, he only gives Satan enough rope to hang himself. Sure, Satan is doing all these things. Satan is the one bringing darkness into Job's life. But what does Satan want to accomplish? He wants to expose Job as a fraud. He wants to turn him away from God. He wants to break his faith. But what actually happens? What actually gets accomplished? Job gets immortalized in the Bible. Millions of people over time have read and been inspired by Job's life. Millions of people have been actually brought closer to God by Job's suffering, by his faith, by his courage, by his humanity. Not only that, but it brought Job closer to God as well. So what did Satan actually accomplish? He brought Job closer to God, and Job's life and suffering has brought millions of people closer to God. Do you think that's what he wanted to accomplish? To bring people closer to God? Certainly not. Was Job hurt? Yes, he was hurt. But God never wastes a hurt. He didn't bring death or disease or suffering into this world. In fact, he hates it. But he permits it. Why? Because it brings us closer to him. And it utterly defeats Satan's purpose. And this tells us two very important things that I hope you remember when this service is over. If this is how God works with Job, maybe this is how God works with us too. God hates suffering and evil, but he permits it because it can bring us closer to him, and our struggles inspire others. And it utterly defeats Satan's purpose. Speaking of Satan, just take a look at our Prime Minister. No, I just mean that as a joke. Please, please don't take me wrong. Now, I don't know if Justin Trudeau is a Christian or not, but what has been his message during this outbreak? His message is, be good and kind to your neighbor. And what's the greatest commandment? Love God with all your mind, heart, strength, and soul. And to love your neighbor as yourself. That which you do for the least of these, you do for me. And folks, there's lots of acts of kindness happening in this world and in this country today that would not have happened if not for this COVID-19 virus. Even in self-isolation, people are being kind to their neighbors. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that Job never ever finds out why he's suffering. He is never told why. He never understands. God doesn't show up and say, geez, Job, I know this has been awful hard on you, but do you realize that for the rest of time, people are going to be inspired by your courage, by your bravery, by your emotional honesty with yourself and with me? That your faith is going to inspire people who are suffering and bring them closer to me? That because of how you acted throughout your ordeal, that you will have brought millions of people closer to me? That you will have helped them through their time of darkness and suffering? That you have helped change the course of billions of people's lives? No. God never says that to Job. And Job never gets to know the gift that he has been to millions of people. What does God say to Job? He says, who is this who obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Basically, God says, who do you think you are, Job? I'm God. I made you. I made this world. I know what I'm doing here. When dark times comes, the moralist says, oh, we're not living right. We need to be more faithful. We need to be better. We need to get closer to God. The cynic says, There is no reason for God to allow all this evil and suffering. So that means there can't be a God. But this passage says to the moralist, Job lived a very faithful life, and still bad things happened to him. Jesus Christ himself led a sinless life, and yet conflict followed him like a shadow. He was wrongly accused, given a sham trial, sentenced to death, brutally beaten, nailed to a cross, abandoned by the people that he loved the most. Bad things can happen to good people. God doesn't cause that evil, but he will use that evil to bring even greater good out of it. And to the secular cynic, this passage says this: just because you can't think of a reason that God would allow this evil and suffering doesn't mean that there isn't one. To even think that is a position at the height of arrogance. Try telling a 5-year-old that he has to eat his Brussels sprouts. And what's he going to do? He's going to whine and cry and go on. And when you get him calmed down, and you finally get a chance to explain to him that Brussels sprouts are high in fiber and vitamin and minerals, that they're loaded with antioxidants, that they reduce cancer, decrease inflammation, improve blood sugar control. Do you know what that 5-year-old is going to do? He's going to whine, cry, and go on, and still refuse to eat his Brussels sprouts. Why? Because a 5-year-old can't understand nutrition or its importance. All they understand is that Brussels sprouts are green, smell weird, and don't taste like pizza pockets. And I like to think that God is farther above us than we are above a 5-year-old. Job never understood why he had to endure the suffering that he underwent. Yet great good came from it. Peter, James, and John, they didn't understand the suffering that Jesus underwent. Yet it accomplished the salvation of the entire human race. When the communists took over China, they kicked out all the Western missionaries. And the church wasn't in an uproar. They said, oh, the Western missionaries are leaving China. Hundreds of years of Christian missionary work down the drain. Why does God allow that to happen? Why is God abandoning China? But today we can look back and we can understand a little bit about it. You see, because the Christian missionaries were kicked out, the Chinese Christians took over responsibility for their own faith. They made Christianity indigenous. And as a result, it's one of the most vital, fast-growing Christian movements in this world today. It's going to change the world, I think. The history of the world is going to change because when you get 300 million Chinese Christians, it's going to make a huge difference in that country, in that culture, and in our country too. Do we know that was going to happen at the time? No, because we don't have God's perspective. And yet God is using it to create great good. My friends, we have a great and loving God. He is here, and He is in control. COVID-19 has unleashed a lot of fear and uncertainty into this world. But the good news today, on this day, when the world once again is uncertain, the good news is that we can be certain that God is still on His throne. COVID-19 may have shaken the foundations of our world, but I promise you, it has not shaken the foundation of heaven. And there's tremendous comfort and peace knowing that when our world seems out of control, that God is in control. The psalmist in Psalm 20, verse 7 says, "Some nations boast of their armies and weapons, but we boast of our trust in the Lord our God." My friends, I started off today saying that dark times are unavoidable. Even if it's announced today that there is a cure for COVID-19, there will always be some other darkness lurking somewhere down the road. So we are never promised that we will walk through life without suffering or feeling the impact of darkness in our fallen world. What we are promised is that as we go through life, we do not do it alone. I want to end our time here today with words from Psalm 62. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress, and I will never be shaken. Darkness can happen to a believer, but it doesn't mean that you are lost. Darkness can happen to someone who doesn't deserve it. After all, it happened to Jesus Christ. But it doesn't mean that you have strayed. Darkness can happen at any time, because only in the next world can we truly be sure that it will be done away with. Darkness can happen without you knowing why. But there are answers. There is a purpose. And one day, farther along, we'll know why. But today, simply know this, that when the darkness comes, and the world that is darkest, remember that Jesus is the light that shines in the darkness, and that he is guiding our steps, every step of the way. To which I can only say, thanks be to God, and amen.